This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Birchwood was the kind of town that seemed untouched by time. Tucked away in the rolling plains of Texas, its streets were lined with clapboard houses and wide porches, the kind where rocking chairs swayed lazily in the dry breeze. It was a place where life moved slowly, where summer heat clung like a second skin, and where the horizon always seemed just out of reach. Outsiders often described it as picturesque, even idyllic, but those who lived there understood its undercurrent of eerie stillness. This stillness hung in the air like a heavy fog, unnoticed by the townsfolk who took it for granted. The unspoken rituals of Birchwood dictated their lives. Church on Sundays, high school football on Friday nights, and neighborhood potlucks filled their calendars. It was a community built on the comfort of familiarity, where everyone knew everyone's business, or so they thought. In the heart of this placid town was Clara Harper, a girl who seemed to blend seamlessly into the background. At 16, Clara was pale and slight, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she wore loose and unkempt. Her gray eyes had a peculiar sharpness, as if they were always searching for something that wasn't there. She wasn't particularly pretty, nor particularly odd, just one of those teenagers who passed unnoticed in a world obsessed with louder personalities. Teachers called her diligent but distant, and her classmates rarely paid her any attention beyond fleeting interactions. Clara lived with her grandmother, Edith Harper, in a weathered house at the edge of town. The Harpers had always been something of an anomaly in Birchwood. Edith, an aging recluse, was rarely seen outside except to tend her overgrown garden. Her presence was a subject of whispered curiosity, as she never participated in church functions or town events. Clara inherited her grandmother's solitude, often retreating to the woods behind their house for hours at a time. Those woods were Clara's sanctuary, a place where she felt most alive. The towering pines and gnarled oaks formed a natural cathedral, their shadows twisting and bending in the dappled sunlight. Clara would wander the dense underbrush, carrying notebooks filled with sketches and anatomical studies. Dead animals fascinated her. She would find them, study them, and sometimes dissect them with unnerving precision. Her room was cluttered with these drawings, meticulously detailed renderings of bones, sinew, and muscle. To the townsfolk, these interests seemed harmless, if a little strange. Clara had always been a quiet one, and her grandmother's peculiar reputation shielded her from closer scrutiny. But there was something beneath Clara's surface, a hunger that no one could see. That hunger first revealed itself one hot July evening. Birchwood was in the throes of a drought, the kind that cracked the earth and turned the air into a suffocating haze. The heat brought out tempers and silenced laughter, even the cicadas buzzed less fervently. Clara sat on her grandmother's porch, a plate of untouched food in her lap. She stared into the distance, her gaze fixed on nothing, her mind churning with thoughts she couldn't articulate. She had felt it for weeks now, a gnawing emptiness that food couldn't satisfy, a need that grew more insistent each day. It wasn't hunger in the traditional sense, it was deeper, primal. At first she tried to suppress it, burying herself in her books and drawings, but the more she ignored it, the stronger it became. The first incident was small, almost inconsequential. Clara had found a squirrel, freshly killed by a hawk, in the woods behind her house. Something compelled her to take it home, her hands steady as she carried the limp body. In the dim light of the basement, she skinned it with the precision of a surgeon, her fascination growing with each cut. The scent of blood filled the air, metallic and sharp, but Clara didn't flinch. When she cooked the meat later that night, something inside her shifted. The act of consuming it felt intimate, almost sacred. For the first time in weeks, the gnawing emptiness subsided, replaced by a strange sense of satisfaction. Clara didn't question it, she didn't dare. From that moment on, Clara's world changed. She became more withdrawn, her trips to the woods more frequent and more secretive. She began to see the people around her in a new light, not as individuals, but as puzzles of flesh and bone, as potential answers to the hunger that consumed her. She would sit in class, her eyes lingering on the veins in her classmates' hands, the pulse in their necks. At night she lay awake, her mind spiraling into dark fantasies that made her heart race and her hands tremble. Her grandmother, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Clara, chalked up her odd behavior to teenage angst. But the signs were there for anyone willing to look. Clara's sketches grew more detailed, more violent, her notebooks filled with images of dismembered bodies and twisted limbs. She started experimenting with recipes, using strange ingredients she sourced from the woods. The smell of her cooking changed, earthier, darker, and though her grandmother rarely ate, Clara always insisted on preparing their meals. The tipping point came on a sweltering evening in late August. The town was buzzing with preparations for the annual summer festival, a rare moment of unity in Birchwood. Families gathered in the square, their laughter and music echoing into the night. Clara, however, stayed home. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on a butcher knife that gleamed under the dim light. In that moment, a decision crystallized in her mind. The hunger would no longer be ignored. It wasn't just a craving, it was a need, an uncontrollable force that demanded to be satisfied. Clara didn't feel fear or hesitation, only a cold, methodical determination. Birchwood, with its facade of tranquility, was about to discover the darkness that had been festering in its midst. Clara Harper, the quiet girl no one noticed, would soon become the name whispered in fear, the story told to warn children about the monsters that could live among them. And she was ready to embrace it. The Perkins family was the epitome of suburban bliss, a symbol of everything the townsfolk in Birchwood aspired to be. The father, George Perkins, was a cheerful mechanic who owned a small auto repair shop at the town's edge. His wife, Linda, was a homemaker with a penchant for baking, known for her pies that won ribbons at local fairs. They had 2 children, 12-year-old Timmy, a freckled boy with boundless energy, and 8-year-old Susie, whose wide blue eyes seemed to sparkle with innocence. Together, they were the kind of family whose laughter filled their home and spilled onto their neatly trimmed lawn. For Clara Harper, the Perkins family represented an ideal she could never attain. Their warmth and affection were foreign to her, an alien language she could only observe from a distance. Yet, it wasn't envy that drew her to them, it was something far darker. They became an obsession, the first subjects in what Clara now viewed as a grand experiment. Clara's plan began with calculated precision. She spent weeks studying the Perkins family, noting their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. George left for work every morning at 7:30, returning promptly at 6. Linda spent her afternoons gardening, her children often playing nearby under her watchful eye. On Sundays, they attended the same church Clara avoided, their pew always filled with radiant smiles. Clara's first move was subtle. One afternoon, she approached Linda as she worked in her garden, offering a basket of freshly picked wildflowers. Linda, touched by the gesture, invited Clara to stay for lemonade. It was the perfect opportunity to weave herself into their lives. She charmed Linda with compliments about her garden and expressed interest in Timmy and Susie's school activities. Her quiet demeanor disarmed Linda, who saw Clara as a polite, lonely girl in need of companionship. Soon Clara became a regular visitor to the Perkins household. She babysat the children, helped Linda in the kitchen, and even played board games with George on occasion. Each visit allowed her to gather more information, to study their habits and weaknesses. She noticed how Timmy always left his milk untouched at dinner, how Susie had a habit of twirling her hair when she was nervous. These details weren't merely observations, they were pieces of a puzzle Clara was assembling. The night of the attack was chosen with care. It was a Friday, and George had spent the evening fixing a neighbor's truck, leaving him tired and distracted. Clara arrived unannounced, carrying a casserole dish she had prepared as a thank you for the family's kindness. The dish was laced with a potent mix of sedatives Clara had painstakingly researched, brewed from plants she collected in the woods. The Perkins family, ever trusting, welcomed her warmly. They sat together at the dining table, the aroma of the casserole filling the air. Clara watched intently as each family member took their first bite, her pulse quickening as the sedatives began to take effect. It started subtly. Timmy complained of feeling dizzy, Susie's eyelids grew heavy, and George's cheerful conversation slowed to a slurred murmur. Within minutes, they were unconscious, slumped over the table like marionettes with their strings cut. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara stood amidst the stillness, her chest heaving with exhilaration and fear. For a moment she hesitated, the enormity of what she was about to do crashing over her like a tidal wave. But the hunger was there, gnawing at the edges of her sanity, urging her forward. She dragged their limp bodies to the basement, one by one. The space had been meticulously prepared. Plastic sheets covered the floor, and an assortment of knives, saws, and other tools were laid out in an unnervingly neat arrangement. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood even before the first incision was made. Clara began with George, her hands surprisingly steady as she worked. Her movements were clinical, detached, as if she were performing a dissection in biology class. She marveled at the layers of muscle and fat, the intricate network of veins. It was beautiful, in a grotesque way, a reminder of the fragile machinery that kept the human body alive. Linda was next. Clara hesitated briefly as she stared at the woman's lifeless face, her features still softened by trust and kindness. But the hunger overshadowed any lingering guilt. As the blade cut through flesh, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of control, a power she had never experienced before. Timmy and Susie were the hardest. Their small, fragile bodies seemed to plead with her, even in death. Clara's hands trembled as she worked, but she forced herself to continue. This was the culmination of her plan, the moment she had envisioned so many times in the dark recesses of her mind. When it was over, the basement was a scene of unspeakable horror. Blood pooled on the plastic sheets and the air was thick with the stench of death. Clara's clothes were soaked, her face splattered with crimson streaks, yet she felt no revulsion, no remorse, only satisfaction. She spent the next few hours meticulously cleaning the basement, disposing of what she deemed unnecessary remains in the woods behind her house. The rest she carefully packaged and stored in her refrigerator, each piece labeled with an almost obsessive attention to detail. The disappearance of the Perkins family sent shockwaves through Birchwood. Search parties combed the area, and flyers with their smiling faces were plastered on every lamppost and storefront. Neighbors shared theories over coffee, their voices tinged with fear and disbelief. Clara feigned concern, joining the search efforts and offering condolences to those who knew the family well. Days turned into weeks, and the town's hope began to wane. The Perkins family became another tragic mystery, a ghostly presence that lingered in the minds of those who had loved them. Clara, meanwhile, continued her dark experiments, each meal bringing her closer to understanding the hunger that drove her. The Perkins family had been her first, but Clara knew they wouldn't be her last. Birchwood, with its trusting smiles and unspoken secrets, was a buffet waiting to be devoured. And Clara Harper, the quiet girl no one noticed, was just getting started. In the weeks following the Perkins family's disappearance, Birchwood was swept into a storm of unease. Flyers bearing their faces flapped in the dry Texas wind, curling at the edges as they were pinned to telephone poles and shop windows. The Perkins had vanished without a trace, and though whispers of foul play began to circulate, no one suspected the quiet girl who walked among them, her steps light and her expression serene. Clara Harper had perfected the art of duality. On the surface, she was still the same unassuming teenager, polite to her neighbors, attentive in class, a ghost that moved unnoticed through the routines of the town. But beneath that placid exterior churned a world of unspeakable darkness. Clara lived in two realities, each feeding off the other. By day, she was the quiet girl from the edge of town, blending into the fabric of Birchwood. By night, she descended into the hell she had built for herself, where flesh and bone were no longer abstractions but tools for her insatiable hunger. The basement of her grandmother's house had become a secret chamber of horrors. Clara's meticulous cleaning after the Perkins family ensured there were no immediate traces of her atrocities, but the space had been irrevocably transformed. The plastic sheets remained, carefully folded and ready for use, and shelves lined the walls, stocked with tools that gleamed under the dim, flickering light of a single bulb. A small freezer in the corner hummed softly, its contents a chilling catalog of her crimes neatly wrapped and labeled cuts of human flesh. The freezer had become a source of both fascination and guilt for Clara. Each time she opened it, a wave of cold air carried the smell of death, sharp and metallic. Yet it also brought a twisted sense of pride. Every package represented a piece of her mastery, a step closer to understanding the hunger that drove her. She treated each meal as an experiment, pairing the meat with herbs and spices, testing textures and flavors. Sometimes she ate in silence, savoring every bite. Other times she wept, her tears mingling with the blood on her hands. At school, Clara maintained her mask of normalcy with precision. She listened intently in biology class, her fascination with anatomy earning her quiet praise from her teachers. Her sketches grew more detailed, her notebooks filled with diagrams of organs and skeletal structures that seemed almost clinical. But in the margins, darker drawings began to emerge, figures dismembered, flesh peeled back to expose the secrets beneath. She kept these hidden, careful not to arouse suspicion. Her classmates, oblivious to the abyss that lay beneath Clara's surface, remained indifferent to her presence. To them, she was simply that quiet girl, the one who sat at the back of the classroom and avoided eye contact. But Clara watched them closely, her gray eyes lingering on the curve of a neck, the movement of tendons beneath the skin. She saw them not as friends or peers, but as puzzles waiting to be unraveled, potential meals to satiate the hunger that never truly left her. Clara's routine took on an unsettling rhythm. After school, she would venture into the woods, her backpack filled with supplies. The forest had always been her sanctuary, but now it served a darker purpose. She hunted small animals, testing her skills and refining her techniques. The act of killing had become second nature, her hands steady as she delivered precise cuts. These smaller acts of violence were her practice, a rehearsal for the larger stage she knew she would return to soon. In town, Clara began to engage with her neighbors in ways she never had before. She brought baked goods to the elderly couple down the street, helped a single mother carry groceries, and even volunteered to tutor a struggling younger student. These acts of kindness were calculated, each one designed to deepen the trust that shielded her from suspicion. The townsfolk began to see her not as an odd recluse, but as a caring, if quiet, young girl. Behind closed doors, however, Clara's grip on her dual life began to slip. The hunger was relentless, an ever-present gnawing that consumed her thoughts. She found herself staring at her own reflection for hours, her gray eyes searching for something human in the pale face staring back at her. Sometimes she would press her hands to her chest, feeling the steady thrum of her heartbeat, and wondering how many beats she had left before the darkness inside her swallowed her whole. Her grandmother Edith remained blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding in her own home. Old age and illness had left her bedridden, her days spent in a fog of medication and fading memories. Clara tended to her dutifully, bringing her meals and changing her sheets with a tenderness that seemed almost genuine. But even Edith began to sense something was amiss. There was a coldness in Clara's touch, a hollowness in her gaze that made her shiver even in the heat of the Texas summer. The turning point came one evening when Clara hosted a dinner for a few neighbors. It was a simple gathering: homemade stew, fresh bread, and laughter that echoed through the small dining room. Clara moved through the evening with an ease that belied the truth, her polite smiles and soft laughter hiding the monstrous secret of what lay simmering in the pot. The neighbors praised her cooking, their compliments filling the air as they ladled second and third helpings into their bowls. Clara watched them with an eerie calm, her own plate untouched. She studied their faces, their gestures, the way their hands moved as they brought the food to their lips. She felt a sick satisfaction knowing they were unwitting participants in her experiment, that they were consuming the fruits of her darkness. When the dinner ended and the neighbors left, Clara sat alone in the empty dining room, the echo of their laughter still ringing in her ears. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something akin to triumph. She had succeeded in blending her two worlds, in maintaining the delicate balance of her double life. But as the night wore on and the house grew silent, the hunger returned, stronger than ever. It was no longer a whisper but a scream, demanding to be fed. Clara knew then that the Perkins family had only been the beginning. The line she had crossed could not be uncrossed, and the mask she wore was beginning to crack. As she descended into the basement once more, the cold air of the freezer enveloping her like a shroud, Clara realized that her double life was unsustainable. The darkness inside her was growing, threatening to spill out and consume everything in its path. And yet, a part of her welcomed it. The Rodriguezes arrived in Birchwood as an anomaly, a family of outsiders in a town deeply entrenched in its own rhythms and traditions. Hector and Marisol Rodriguez had moved with their two young children, 7-year-old Mateo and 5-year-old Isabel, from the bustling sprawl of Houston to the quiet, unassuming town. Hector, a carpenter, had taken a job refurbishing an old church, and Marisol, a homemaker, spent her days tending to their modest rental house. Unlike the Perkins, whose absence still hung over the town like a dark cloud, the Rodriguezes were unknown enough to slip into Birchwood unnoticed. Clara Harper had seen them once, through the grimy window of the general store, their voices faint as they discussed grocery prices in soft Spanish. To Clara, they were new and unfamiliar, an unwritten chapter waiting to be filled with her obsessions. She watched them from a distance, carefully crafting her approach. The Rodriguezes were unlike the trusting, insular families Clara had studied before. They were cautious, their movements deliberate, as if wary of the unfamiliar stares that followed them in a predominantly white town. Marisol rarely let the children out of her sight, her eyes sharp with maternal vigilance. Hector, though friendly, carried himself with a quiet stoicism that discouraged intrusion. Clara's first point of entry came one afternoon when she noticed Mateo struggling to ride a bicycle in their gravel driveway. The boy, determined but unsteady, toppled over with a loud cry, scraping his knee on the rough stones. Clara emerged from the shadowed edge of the woods like a specter, her voice soft and soothing as she knelt to examine his wound. Marisol rushed out of the house moments later, her protective instincts flaring. But Clara's calm demeanor and careful words disarmed her. By the time she walked Mateo inside, Clara had planted the seeds of trust. Over the next few weeks, she cultivated this bond, offering to help with errands, dropping off small baked goods, and even watching the children for short periods while Marisol ran to town. It wasn't long before Clara was a familiar face in the Rodriguez household. though Marisol's wariness never entirely faded. She remained cautious, her eyes often lingering on Clara with a quiet suspicion. Clara noticed this and adjusted her behavior accordingly, softening her already demure demeanor. She would sit with Isabel on the living room floor, her hands deftly folding paper into delicate origami cranes that delighted the little girl. She helped Mateo with his math homework, her tone patient and kind. Despite her efforts, Clara sensed the walls Marisol had built around her family. They were too rigid to breach entirely, and this only fueled her obsession. She began to imagine what lay beyond those barriers, what the Rodriguezes might look like stripped of their guarded exteriors. The hunger clawed at her, demanding she act before the opportunity slipped away. One evening, Clara arrived at their home with a casserole dish, claiming it was a recipe she wanted Marisol to try. Hector wasn't home, he was finishing a late shift at the church, and Marisol reluctantly accepted, inviting Clara to join them for dinner. The scene was eerily reminiscent of the Perkins' final night, the table set with mismatched plates, the faint sound of laughter echoing from the children, and Clara's quiet, watchful presence among them. As they ate, Clara studied each member of the family. Mateo, chewing absent-mindedly as he swung his legs under the table. Isabel, humming softly to herself as she spooned food into her mouth. Marisol, her fork paused mid-air as she scanned Clara's face with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The sedatives took longer to work this time. Marisol's vigilance extended even to her food, and she had eaten only a few bites. But the children succumbed quickly, their small bodies slumping in their chairs. Clara felt a pang of irritation as Marisol pushed her plate aside, her sharp eyes narrowing. "What did you do?" Though the words were never spoken aloud, Clara could see them etched in Marisol's expression. The woman rose from her chair, her hand reaching instinctively for Isabel, but it was already too late. Clara acted swiftly, her body moving with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. By the time Hector arrived home, the house was silent. The front door creaked as he stepped inside, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. The smell hit him first, an acrid, metallic scent that seemed to coat the back of his throat. He called out for his wife and children, his voice trembling slightly as it echoed into the stillness. What he found in the kitchen was beyond comprehension. The table was overturned, chairs scattered across the floor. Blood smeared the walls in chaotic streaks, handprints marking desperate attempts to escape. Hector's knees buckled as he collapsed in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the small, lifeless bodies of Mateo and Isabel, their faces pale and serene. Marisol was nowhere to be found. Hector's cries filled the house, guttural and broken, as he stumbled through the rooms in search of his wife. He found her in the basement, her body crumpled against the cold, concrete floor. Clara had been meticulous, leaving no signs of a struggle beyond the blood that pooled beneath Marisol's motionless form. Clara had disappeared into the night, leaving the Rodriguez house a silent tomb. The discovery of the Rodriguezes shook Birchwood to its core. Their deaths were too brutal, too senseless to dismiss as mere misfortune. The whispers that had begun with the Perkins now grew louder, darker, as the townsfolk grappled with the realization that something monstrous was lurking among them. But Clara remained undetected. She watched the chaos unfold from the shadows, her gray eyes unblinking, as the search parties combed the woods and the sheriff held press conferences in the town square. She felt no guilt, no regret, only a deep, hollow satisfaction that was already beginning to wane. The hunger was insatiable, a black hole that consumed everything in its path. And Clara Harper, the quiet girl from the edge of town, was already planning her next move. By the time the Rodriguezes were found, the town of Birchwood was no longer the quiet, unassuming place it had been. A shadow loomed over its streets, filling every home with unease. Parents kept their children indoors, and neighbors avoided making eye contact as they passed on the street. The sheriff's office, overwhelmed and ill-equipped, fumbled for answers. 2 families had vanished, then reappeared as corpses in their own homes. The brutality of the killings, coupled with the lack of evidence, turned Birchwood into a community ruled by fear. Sheriff Thomas Aldridge had seen his share of violence, but nothing prepared him for the scenes at the Perkins and Rodriguez homes. The meticulous cruelty spoke of something inhuman, a predator wearing the skin of a person. The town buzzed with theories, an outsider passing through, a drifter, perhaps someone possessed by madness. But Aldridge wasn't convinced. He knew Birchwood too well, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the killer wasn't an outsider. Weeks turned into months, and the case stalled. Leads grew cold and fear turned to suspicion. Birchwood's residents began to look inward, their trust in each other unraveling. Whispered accusations filled the air, small slights from the past resurfacing as imagined motives. Yet through it all, Clara Harper remained invisible, a quiet girl who had perfected the art of blending in. But Clara's mask was beginning to slip. The hunger that drove her had grown more demanding, more reckless. The killings no longer satisfied her, they were merely the means to an end she couldn't define. Her behavior shifted in subtle ways, her gray eyes lingered too long on her neighbors, her questions about their lives a shade too curious. It was this growing boldness that finally drew attention. Clara had started to venture further from her home at odd hours, disappearing into the woods or the outskirts of town. She was seen rifling through the garbage behind the diner, her hands stained with something too dark to be dirt. A local woman noticed Clara standing outside the school playground, her gaze fixed on the children in a way that made her stomach churn. The rumors started small but spread quickly. Sheriff Aldridge took notice. He began piecing together the fragments of gossip and minor incidents, forming a picture that disturbed him deeply. Clara Harper, quiet, unobtrusive Clara, had a connection to both families. She had been seen at the Perkins home multiple times before their disappearance. She had helped Marisol Rodriguez with her groceries just days before her death. On their own, these details meant little, but in the context of Birchwood's escalating terror, they became damning threads in a larger, darker tapestry. Aldridge decided to investigate further. He visited Clara's grandmother, Edith Harper, under the guise of a routine welfare check. The old woman, frail and confused, was eager to talk, though her memories were scattered and unreliable. She mentioned Clara's solitary nature, her long walks in the woods, and her strange fascination with cooking. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as Edith described the peculiar smells that sometimes wafted from the kitchen late at night, smells she couldn't identify but found deeply unsettling. The visit left Aldridge shaken. His instincts screamed at him to dig deeper, but he lacked concrete evidence. Birchwood's fear-stricken residents were already on edge, and he couldn't risk accusing a teenage girl without proof. Still, he assigned an officer to quietly monitor Clara, noting her movements and interactions. The breaking point came when a hunter stumbled across a gruesome discovery in the woods behind Clara's home. While tracking deer, he found a shallow pit filled with bones. They were not animal remains, they were human, their surfaces scored with knife marks that spoke of deliberate, brutal carving. The hunter reported the find to the sheriff, his face pale and his hands trembling. Aldridge's blood ran cold as he examined the site. He recognized fragments of bone that matched the descriptions from the Perkins and Rodriguez autopsies. This wasn't a random dumping ground, it was a butcher's discard pile. The killer had been here, working methodically, discarding what they didn't need. The sheriff knew he couldn't wait any longer. He assembled a small team and secured a warrant to search the Harper property. The operation was quiet, designed to avoid alarming the already panicked town. At dawn, they approached the house, their footsteps muffled by the dry grass. Clara was in the basement when they arrived. She had been preparing for her next experiment, her hands slick with crimson as she worked with mechanical precision. The knock on the door startled her, her gray eyes snapping to the ceiling. For the first time, she felt the cold grip of fear. The search of the house was thorough, and what they found defied comprehension. In the basement, the sheriff and his deputies uncovered a macabre laboratory of death. Plastic sheets coated the floor, stained with dried blood. Knives, saws, and other tools were arranged neatly on a workbench, their edges gleaming in the dim light. A freezer hummed ominously in the corner, its contents meticulously wrapped and labeled. When Aldridge opened the freezer, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were packages of human remains, each labeled with dates and cryptic notations. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay and the weight of what they had uncovered. Upstairs, they found Clara sitting in the kitchen, her hands folded neatly on the table. She didn't resist as they arrested her, her expression calm but empty. It was as if the part of her that could feel fear or guilt had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell. The town of Birchwood was plunged into chaos as news of Clara's crime spread. Her trial became a spectacle, drawing reporters from across the state. The details of her actions were revealed piece by piece, each more horrifying than the last. The townsfolk who had once dismissed her as that quiet girl now looked back on every interaction with her, questioning how they had missed the monster in their midst. Clara Harper, for her part, remained silent. She sat through the trial with an unsettling composure, her gray eyes fixed on nothing. The hunger that had driven her for so long was still there, a gnawing presence she couldn't escape. In the end, Clara was sentenced to life in a juvenile facility, her crimes too severe for leniency. As the doors of the prison closed behind her, Birchwood was left to pick up the pieces, haunted by the realization that the evil they feared had grown in their own backyard. Birchwood was never the same after Clara Harper's arrest. The town that once prided itself on neighborly trust and close-knit families had become a husk of its former self, hollowed out by fear and suspicion. The revelations of Clara's atrocities had seeped into every corner, leaving an indelible stain on the collective psyche of its residents. The discovery of what Clara had done spread like wildfire, burning through the community with an intensity that left no one untouched. The Perkins and Rodriguez families were no longer just missing persons or victims of a senseless crime. They had become symbols of the unimaginable horror that had festered in their midst. Their deaths, their desecration, were whispered about behind locked doors, each detail fueling a growing paranoia that consumed the town. The Harper house became a grotesque landmark, a place where no one dared to linger. Its peeling paint and sagging roof stood as a silent testament to the evil that had lived there. Children dared each other to run up to the front steps at night, their bravery dissolving into shrieks of terror at the slightest sound. The more superstitious residents believed the house was cursed, its walls imbued with the darkness of Clara's deeds. For weeks after the arrest, Birchwood was inundated with reporters, their vans clogging the narrow streets and their cameras capturing every anguished face. They interviewed anyone willing to talk: neighbors, classmates, former teachers, all of whom struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming girl with the monster revealed in court. The media dubbed her the Butcher of Birchwood, a title that further alienated the town from the outside world. But it wasn't just the reporters who unearthed old wounds. The community began turning on itself, searching for someone to blame. How had no one seen the signs? Who had failed to stop Clara before she killed not one but two families? The school faced harsh criticism for not flagging her unsettling behavior. Parents who had allowed their children to interact with Clara were consumed with guilt, replaying every moment in their heads, searching for clues they had missed. For some, the blame fell squarely on Edith Harper, Clara's reclusive grandmother. Though bedridden and frail, she became a scapegoat, the town's anger directed at her, as if she had somehow orchestrated her granddaughter's descent into madness. Edith, too weak to defend herself, passed away mere weeks after Clara's arrest, her death largely unnoticed in a town too consumed by its own grief. The schools were no longer sanctuaries. Clara's classmates, those who had barely acknowledged her existence, now found themselves plagued by guilt. They remembered the moments when her gray eyes had lingered on them too long, or when her strange drawings were glimpsed in the margins of her notebooks. Teachers recalled the essays she had written about anatomy, the chilling precision of her sketches. What had once been dismissed as oddities now seemed like glaring red flags. Children, once carefree and full of laughter, began sleeping with lights on, their nights haunted by nightmares of Clara's basement. Parents became overprotective, watching their kids with hawk-like intensity, their trust shattered. Even the most mundane interactions were tinged with suspicion. An overly friendly neighbor, a polite stranger in the grocery store, anyone could be hiding something. The Perkins and Rodriguez funerals were held just weeks apart, their proximity amplifying the town's grief. The services were somber and tightly attended, the air thick with an unspoken dread. The closed caskets were a painful reminder of what Clara had taken from them, the final indignities suffered by their loved ones too horrific to confront directly. For Hector Rodriguez, life became an unbearable blur. He moved away shortly after the funeral, unable to remain in the house where his wife and children had been taken from him. His departure left behind a house as silent as the Harper residence, its windows dark and uninviting. The Rodriguez's presence faded from Birchwood, leaving only the echo of their absence. In the aftermath, Birchwood's remaining residents tried to move on, but the town itself seemed unwilling to let them forget. The woods where Clara had hidden her crimes became a place of legend, whispered about by those brave enough to venture near. Hunters and hikers reported strange feelings of being watched, the rustling of leaves taking on an ominous tone. Some claimed to see fleeting figures among the trees, their imaginations weaving specters from Clara's victims. The townsfolk who stayed became prisoners of their own memories. They avoided the Harper house, crossing the street, rather than walking past its darkened windows. The sight of a freezer, even in a harmless context, now evoked shudders and nausea. The smell of meat cooking, a staple in the town's many barbecues, became unbearable to some, the scent forever linked to the gruesome details of Clara's culinary experiments. Sheriff Aldridge bore the weight of the community's despair. Though he had led the investigation that ultimately unmasked Clara, the knowledge of what he had uncovered haunted him. Nights were the worst, when the images from her basement flooded back unbidden, the blood-stained plastic sheets, the freezer's grotesque contents, the calm expression on Clara's face as she was led away in handcuffs. He often sat alone in his office, staring at the case files as if they held answers he had yet to uncover. As time dragged on, the town tried to rebuild itself, but the scars remained visible. The annual summer festival was canceled indefinitely, its joyful celebration now a bitter reminder of what had been lost. The church pews grew emptier each Sunday as faith in both God and humanity dwindled. Birchwood had become a place defined by its darkness, a community perpetually looking over its shoulder. Clara Harper, confined to a juvenile detention facility, was rarely mentioned by name anymore. But her shadow lingered. Parents warned their children about talking to strangers or wandering off alone, their voices trembling as they gave these cautions. Birchwood had learned the hard way that monsters didn't always lurk in the dark. They could live among you, unnoticed, until it was too late. And though the town tried to forget, the silence of its streets told a different story. The horror Clara had unleashed had seeped into Birchwood's foundations, ensuring that no one who lived there would ever truly leave it behind.